The BBC, and after a week of headlines and many behind-the-scenes conversations, a series of statements announcing that both the Director General and the Chief Executive of News are resigning.
The BBC reporting on the BBC about a scandal that's already claimed two bosses, forced an apology and taken a sledgehammer to trust in journalism.
This BBC crisis didn't come out of nowhere.
No, it didn't. It came out of a leaked memo.
So tell us about what was in this leaked memo.
Ros, it didn't just cover the controversial edit of the Trump speech on January 6th. It also covered a range of other issues. It was written as a sort of despairing complaint to the board by this advisor who essentially was saying, look, it's not just that there are a range of complaints and problems with what's been going on at the BBC, but my concern is that they are not being addressed and they're not even being taken seriously.
There's both a narrow story here about this edit and then a very big story about the state of the British broadcasting system.
And it's not just serious for the BBC, it is serious basically for all the mainstream media outlets in the English-speaking world. This is the kind of stuff that has crashed and still continues to crash public trust in the media. Because if you thought that the media was unfair on Trump, now you've been proven right.
If you can't trust the BBC, who can you trust? Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, the editing scandal that has plunged the world's most reliable state broadcaster into crisis, how it happened, the likelihood of restoring credibility, and what it means worldwide for an industry already battling serious trust issues.
When media organisations breach the trust they have with their audience, they're in big trouble.
That's Jim Tully, long-time journalism educator and media commentator. In a moment, I talk to him about journalism ethics and trust.
Well, there are always surveys in which we don't figure much ahead of used car salesmen.
I also talk to Sean Hogan, a freelance correspondent in the UK who was on the ground in London.
I think they'll just be hoping that this, news cycle on this story dies like a really quick death and it doesn't unearth any more serious issues.
But first, what actually happened? Here's the BBC's analysis editor, Ros Atkins, explaining it on the BBC.
The immediate focus is BBC Panorama's editing of Donald Trump's speech on the day of the Capitol riots in January 2021, during which he said this.
And after this, we're going to walk down and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
54 minutes later, we heard this.
And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Just before last year's US election, Panorama edited these two clips together.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you. And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
It appeared to be one statement, but it wasn't. And that's an issue, regardless of Trump's actions on January the 6th. And in a memo leaked to The Telegraph, former independent editorial advisor to the BBC board, Michael Prescott, says he raised this edit and that the BBC executive doubled down on its defence of Panorama. That's not the position now.
Not at all. After a long silence, the BBC took dramatic action on Monday.
The Director General of the BBC and the CEO of BBC News have both resigned after a week of criticism and allegations of editorial mistakes by the British broadcaster.
Chair Samir Shah has said the BBC would like to apologise for this error of judgment. For his part, Donald Trump alleges the BBC tried to step on the scales of a presidential election, which the BBC denies. But now Trump has sent a letter to the BBC threatening legal action.
And tonight, a statement from Donald Trump castigating the BBC, saying they were caught doctoring my very good, perfect speech of January the 6th.
The scandal has blown up internationally, and in London, where Sean Hogan is based, the fallout is particularly devastating.
People are calling it a storm, a crisis, a disaster, but it's quite extraordinary, really. I mean, from a journalistic point of view, it's shocking that the splicing and sticking together of clips was allowed to be published without any transparency at all, and that it has taken so long for the BBC to do something about it. Some are saying that it's the biggest scandal the BBC has faced in decades. The resignations that we've seen are a result of a culmination of a number of scandals that have really been turning up the pressure on the BBC and continue to plague the broadcaster.
I'll have more on those scandals later in the podcast.
And something had to give, and I think this is the straw, although admittedly a huge one, that has really broken the camel's back, and public trust has just been continuously eroded, and they've got to try and change the narrative somehow.
BBC is known for its trust. What about the British audiences? How have they reacted? Is this sort of seen as a one-off mistake, or is it sort of a sign of perhaps deeper problems within BBC?
I think the latter. Since viewers became aware of this edited quote, over 500 complaints have been made to the BBC about the programme. And I think the general public sentiment is an increased level of scepticism. The BBC model, if I can explain, in the UK is a public pay. So the public pay a mandatory licence fee to stream and watch BBC programming, which helps fund the service. Now, I pay it. I wouldn't call it cheap. So it's understandable that people are feeling like they aren't really getting the best bang for their buck right now. And as you said, the public trust is so critical for an organisation like the BBC, and it's just been chipped away at recently. And it's now up to them to try and revert that course.
I'm curious, how much is it to pay for this?
It's about £170. So if I'm being generous with the exchange rate right now, it's about 340 New Zealand dollars a year to watch the BBC.
Gosh, not cheap. What about the actual BBC inside the corporation? How are staff coping with this? Because there must be so much scrutiny and backlash.
Yeah, totally. I mean, reports have surfaced that BBC staff, especially amongst the news division, are not happy with how things have been handled and the rough time they're getting in the media. The outgoing Director General, now outgoing Director General, Tim Davie, addressed staff in a meeting. And he admitted the BBC had made mistakes that had cost it, but it also added that they had to fight for their journalism. But now, according to BBC's own reporting, there is a feeling that the BBC is not fighting hard enough for its journalism, and another narrative has taken hold that is tainting the whole output. Now, I know people that work at the BBC, I'm sure you do as well, and they're very proud to. And I don't think anybody expects the BBC or its journalists to be 100% perfect all the time. But recently it's been nothing but scandal after another scandal, and for them to keep defending, and that must be really tiring.
What about other UK media? How are they covering the scandal? Is there a sort of a pile-on, or is there sort of a sense of defending the public broadcaster?
I think a pile-on is perhaps maybe a light way to put it, Amanda. The media and the public over here, they love a story about the media. And many of the UK outlets love to hold a microscope very closely to the BBC. It's never far from the headlines, so it wasn't a surprise to see that this story has been splashed all over our screens and front pages since it broke, and it really hasn't relented. I'll give you a few of the headlines. There's BBC meltdown, BBC humiliation, and the BBC in crisis, and that's just a few of them. Now, every former BBC journalist is seemingly using this opportunity now to launch their own Substack or vent their own views on a podcast of how they think it should be run. Now, to be fair to the BBC, their own website and channel hasn't shied away from the story and has covered the issue extensively. And the Daily Telegraph, who originally broke the story of the leaked memo, has really sunk their teeth into it, including printing Donald Trump's own praising of their work on their front page yesterday.
The BBC is facing extermination. Tim Davie has gone, Deborah Turnus has gone, and the BBC is shaken by accusations of fake news.
We're going to be speaking to former BBC boss Danny Cohen and addressing those claims that it was the Telegraph what done it, we've staged a coup, and the BBC is an unwitting victim. Tim, if the BBC was writing a headline about this story, would it be BBC in crisis or BBC victim of coup by Telegraph? Because that's the two different strains of this that we need to discuss on today's Daily Tea.
And what a story it's been, Sean. What about the political response? What has that been?
Well, it's been an expected contrast of views. So those on the right, political leaders like Reform leader Nigel Farage, who we know is a big fan of President Trump, now his party is currently leading in the public polls here, and he's seeing an opportunity, and he's saying that the BBC has been institutionally biased for decades and has really ramped up that rhetoric by mounting his own attack on the organisation's reputation. One of the only politicians to mount a really open defence for the BBC is the Liberal Democrats leader, Sir Ed Davey, who has called on political leaders to really stand united behind the organisation. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, a spokesperson for him, has said that the PM has rejected Farage's claim and he doesn't think that the BBC is institutionally biased. But this really comes at a crucial and sensitive time for them, with the government set to review its royal charter. Now, the charter is what sets out the terms and purposes of the corporation's operations. The UK's Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, who was in the Commons today, described this matter as very serious, but said the BBC is essential to this country and they would be beginning the review imminently. And what that looks like is still quite unclear, but it's in almost impeccable timing when it comes to these things. The BBC's chair, Samir Shah, is going to lay out his own vision for the BBC's future at Parliament on Monday, which I think a lot of people will be watching very closely.
Oh, I bet. I read a piece saying that this is effectively a hit job because BBC are seen as being left, and this is by the right taking down the left bosses. What are you hearing on that?
Well, yeah, there is a claim which seemingly started from a former Sun newspaper editor that suggested this was a hit job or a coup on the BBC by Conservatives who were actually elected onto the organisation's board during the last Conservative government. Many have, of course, been quick to jump on calls for resignations, including former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And another former Prime Minister, Conservative Liz Truss, has even called for the end of the nationalised broadcasting altogether. Many have spoken to journalists at the BBC who, of course, are livid at the idea of that and believe that this theory of a coup could have legs. But I think when it comes to the editorial mistakes it's making, it's them who have brought this criticism on themselves at the moment. And we're really seeing that come to a head over here.
What about, this is a real hit for the BBC. How do they rebuild that trust and reclaim that trust, not only in the UK, but also globally?
Well, I think it's going to take a lot of time. BBC Chair Samir Shah, he's tried to get on the front foot of the story and has faced criticisms for being too slow to act on these complaints, bearing in mind that it took them 11 months since that documentary aired with those clipped Trump clips for the BBC to publicly admit that it had made a mistake. And Shah has said that action has been taken to address issues. They've published corrections and clarifications, supplied new editorial guidance, and executed disciplinary action in some cases. But what I think is obvious is that rebuilding of trust is going to take a while and will need a lot of work from the BBC to rebuild that trust back in the British public.
And not just with the British public, but with BBC consumers around the world, including here. Longtime Kiwi journalism educator Jim Tully says trust is essential in media, so he was taken aback by the editing scandal.
Well, I thought this is going to have potentially some significant reputational damage because it's crucial that our readers, listeners, viewers trust us, and anything we do that undermines that trust is potentially quite harmful to the reputation of the organisation.
And the BBC in particular, what is their reputation? How do normally viewers and readers view it?
Well, I know the BBC sees itself as the bastion of impartial and accurate reporting, so they've, staked their reputation on that since the 30s. And I think most people would see the BBC as a trustworthy media organisation.
So how damaging, in your words, is this incident for their credibility, both in the UK and internationally?
Well, of itself, this particular episode with Trump is going to be coloured by the way in which people think about Trump. But if you put it in a broader context where they've been criticised for bias in relation to their coverage of Gaza, Trump and Israel, reporting of transgender reporting matters, even Glastonbury's story.
If you were not across those stories, here are some of the details, starting with the fallout from a BBC Gaza doco, which aired at the beginning of the year.
In February, it broadcast a documentary about Gaza. After broadcast, it emerged the child narrator's father was a Hamas official. The BBC withdrew the programme after days of controversy.
It goes to the heart, it's a dagger to the heart of the BBC's claim to be impartial.
Then the BBC pulled another Gaza doco, an independently made one called Medics Under Fire. That was due to impartiality concerns. And this was followed by the Glastonbury scandal.
And a performance by Bob Villan, which featured chants of death to the IDF. Tim Davies said as soon as he heard about it, he decided not to make the performance available on demand. But it was available for hours as part of a longer stream on BBC iPlayer.
I mean, the BBC made a very significant mistake. Very significant in broadcasting that.
Other high-profile controversies from the past involved BBC presenters Hugh Edwards, child pornography, Jimmy Savile, sex offending, and Martin Bashir, who faked documents to secure an interview with Princess Diana.
In that context, you'd have to say that it's part of a bigger picture that is quite worrying.
For this latest one, Jim, they've made obviously an apology. Well, initially they were very quiet. Then they've come out with this apology and they've got the resignations of the bosses. Do you think that is enough to restore some public trust, or is the fallout, do you think, far from over?
Well, I think the resignations of people at that level should send a message to the public that they take matters seriously, and people have obviously fallen on the sword because of the significant damage that, is emerging. The other matter, of course, is Trump's multi-billion whatever legal suit that he's threatening. So in that context, the matter's not going to go away for a while.
From a journalist perspective, and you've had years of teaching journalism, what are, Jim, the ethical red lines when it comes to editing footage, political footage, or sort of context-heavy material like this?
I think the guidelines are pretty clear and widely accepted. Really, you may edit in a way for clarity or conciseness, because journalists are not required to report everything that somebody said. Otherwise, we'd be merely stenographers. So we exercise a judgment as to what is interesting and relevant, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The issue arises, of course, when in making those edits, you create a situation where the intended message of the interviewee has been disrupted and you've misrepresented through selective editing what they were saying.
It just seems so crazy that the BBC is guilty of this. But how do you think, mistakes like this, decisions like this, feed into the sort of wider narratives about media bias and public distrust of mainstream outlets?
Well, it's absolutely crucial that we have that trust. Don Hewitt, who created 60 Minutes in the US, had a great quote, which I've trotted out for years, and that is, it is not whether or not they like us that is important. It is whether or not they trust us. So trust is absolutely central to the relationship between a traditional media organisation and the public. This high expectation that they can believe what we're reporting. And if we breach that trust, the damage can be considerable.
Just how bad, Jim, is the trust right now when it comes to our industry?
Well, there are always surveys annually coming out in which we don't figure much ahead of used car salesmen and such like. But it's become fashionable to clobber the media. To me, one of the big issues is that we have legacy media, if you like, who are committed to impartiality and accuracy and fairness and all those wonderful qualities. But we have all sorts of other media outlets that don't give a damn about that kind of thing and who are openly partisan, don't adhere to many of the ethical values that traditional media have. And so in that context, it's easy to see how trust in the media generally is being eroded.
Is one of the problems, we live in a very sort of fast-paced digital era and we want everything now, quick, dirty, immediately. How problematic do you think that is, Jim, for sort of editorial checks and compliance systems? Is it sort of no longer fit for purpose at the moment?
I guess one of the mantras that has always worried me over the last 15 or 20 years is, get it out and tidy it up. Speed being a crucial element in the production of news. And so we knowingly put things out there that are not necessarily totally correct or have issues around them on the basis that, well, yes, we can tidy it up. I mean, in the old days when a newspaper came out in the morning and you couldn't do much about it till the next day in terms of responding to errors and such like. But of course, with internet, I mean, you can tidy it up a few seconds later. So it just seems to me that, if you get a mindset that says, oh, well, we don't have to have 100%. We'll just put it up there and, if there's an issue, well, we can tidy it up later. And that, unfortunately, means that material can go up that is wrong and people will notice that. And they may not notice the tidy up.
One of the things I find interesting is that, like you see the BBC as sort of gospel as the holy grail. They never get anything wrong. And so we take their work and we republish it immediately.
Many of us take the BBC's content, don't we? Often unchecked. There are some media organisations out there that are so beyond reproach that other media outlets like ourselves will take their content and not re-verify it because it's the BBC. It's the BBC. You don't have to re-verify it.
How do you think that's going to change now? And what's your advice there?
Well, I mean, the cardinal, basic, foundational thing of journalism is independent verification. But of course, here in New Zealand, for example, we can't independently verify things that are happening in London or New York or Beijing or wherever. So we are reliant on, we hope, authoritative media organisations and using their material. I mean, a news organisation here, albeit receiving material from overseas, has to trust that that story was correct, just as the viewer or reader or listener has to trust that what we're publishing is correct.
And there's that word trust. What lessons do you think other media organisations, and that includes RNZ, TVNZ, News Talk ZB, Newsroom, what lessons can they take from this?
Only that you have to be extremely aware of what you are doing and recognise that, there are some key principles of basic reporting that you shouldn't transgress. I mean, if you take this one of Trump, the two bits that were spliced together were more than 50 minutes apart. And so I can't believe that somebody could sit there and meld two bits that's so far apart and make it seem as, this was what he was saying. That's just, I think, fundamentally elementary journalism that's being ignored.
Do you think, Jim, that the BBC can recover from this? And what do you think it will take to sort of rebuild faith in, what has been known as one of the world's most trusted news brands?
I think it will be much more of a challenge this time because, people are media savvy in a way they probably weren't 15, 20 years ago. And, they can see what's happened here. And it's going to have a potentially significant effect on the extent to which people think, oh, yep, it's from the BBC, therefore it's correct and I can rely on it, I can believe in it. Once that goes, it's very difficult to reclaim. And there, as I said before, there have been a number of complaints of recent months about their reporting of other issues in terms of being biased and so forth, that it becomes a cumulative thing where, at a certain point, there's a, critical mass that says, whoops, we've got a major problem here and it's going to be really, really difficult to claw back with what we've lost.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Sean Hogan and Jim Tully. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and Alexia Russell and engineered by Alex Harmer. I'm Amanda Gillies. Mā te wā.